Well, welcome, and my name is Jeff Norton. I'm down here in Bremen, Maine, with my wife Rebecca and my son Matt. I have two other children, one in the Czech Republic, whose name is Laura. She's married to a pastor over there, and one Jack, who lives up in Togus with his wife and four kids. So I've got a number of grandkids. I think I'm up to 13 right now, and we're really enjoying life. And I want to tell you a little bit about my story. It's a story about Christ moving in my life, while at times I was very clearly running away from Lord, and then finally at the age of 35, surrendering to Him and running towards Him. So at times it's been an interesting journey, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. Now, I was born in Wallingford, Connecticut, to John and Caroline Norton. And my dad was hardworking. He worked in a steel mill down there his whole life. And my mom, having brought up four children, I had my brother, who we called Tuck, and Tuck unfortunately died at the age of 19. And then I was the second one. And then the third one was Paul, who's down in Florida right now. And the final one, they finally got a girl, Ellen, who lives up in New Gloucester, Maine, and is married to Chuck, and loves the great outdoors, and is very thankful for living in the great state of Maine, as am I. So my dad had super work ethic. His mom was brought up on a farm down there, and like many of that vintage, he went off to war, World War II, and in the Navy, and he went in on Anzio, took a LST into Anzio, and he also went in to North Africa, and then Victory in Europe Day occurred, and he was given a ticket on an ocean liner to come back home, a troop ship actually. And so he came back home, and while he was home on leave for a couple weeks, he married my mom, and then deployed to go to Japan to fight that part of the war. And you think about the courage of my mom marrying a guy who had just come back from significant battles in Europe, and now he's heading to Japan. It makes you wonder, but it really gives you a sense of awe that my dad, who volunteered, as did hundreds of thousands of troops, to fight to preserve our freedom here in the country. And I'm kind of tearing up just thinking about it. But that's where I came from. It's a little bit about my mom and my dad. My mom comes from a family whose grandmother was brought up in South Waldoboro. And so we always came, even though we were living in Connecticut, we always came back this way in the summers. So Maine seemed to be I'll call it my second home, but in reality, it was the home that I desired the most. And I was really privileged to come up here and live back in the early 70s. My wife, Rebecca, is from upstate New York. She's from Ithaca, New York. And she was working in Boston at the time. And I was up here working in a lumber yard down in Waldoboro. This was back in the early 70s. And I was working on an ambulance at that time too. And the guy that ran the ambulance service also led the Lincoln County News, a newspaper. And I was able to get her a job working in advertising at the Lincoln County News. And she also worked at the bookstore over in Damerscott for a while, and we finally got married in 1976. And as I said before, we've got three wonderful children. Now, when I was, even before we got married, I was in the fish business up here. Well, I had a number of jobs. If you've lived up here for a while and you're young, you got plenty of energy, and you need plenty of energy because it takes multiple jobs in order to exist in the state of Maine. There's not a lot of industry around, and unless you're in the fish business, I mean, unless you own a boat, it's really hard to make ends meet. So I had a number of jobs. I did some roofing business. As I said, I peddled fish into the north country of Vermont. I took fish all the way up there and sold it: lobsters, clams, shrimp, things like that. I was in the roofing business for a while as well. I was in the National Guard for a few extra dollars. I was a caretaker on one of the islands out in Muscongas Bay. But the thing I did most often, and the thing I did very well, was partying. And Rebecca was the same way. And so it seemed like we were made for each other, but in fact, we were both accidents waiting to happen, if you will. Very little fulfillment in our life, but we didn't seem to want to willingly give up that lifestyle. And we didn't until things happened out of our control. And one of the things that a couple things I want to tell you. During that time in the 70s, I only knew one Christian who I could really call a Christian. His name was Doug Wood. He was an electrician, and he and his wife were down here along the shore, and we struck up a conversation, and he told us about Jesus. Now, we were far, far, far from accepting Jesus at that point in time, but I really liked Doug, and he worked on the ambulance with me too. So he was a real friend, and he shared his faith with me, and I really appreciate that now. He's now with the Lord. Something happened that was pretty significant in 1977 while I was on trucking fish up to the north country of Vermont, in the Northeast Kingdom up there. On my way home after selling my load, it was in the month of March, and the snow was on the ground coming through Berlin, New Hampshire, and a car was coming the other way, actually coming up from Maine to New Hampshire, and he came across the center line in the middle of a snowstorm and hit my truck head on, 4 inches off dead center. I had a 1971 Ford truck, and the gas tank in those trucks, it was a dual-wheeled 1-ton truck. The gas tank in those trucks was right behind the seat. And I was smoking a cigar about 30 seconds before the accident occurred, and I had thrown it out the window. And the accident occurred, couldn't open the doors. Both vehicles were in pretty bad shape. And I dove out the window thinking that the truck was going to catch a fire. It didn't, but I ended up breaking or cracking a few ribs and a few other things, blackening my eye and things like that. But unfortunately, the driver of the other car didn't survive. He died. So I had a brush with death, if you will, and it was a sad time because the other person had lost his life. And that goes on and plays a little bit later in my story as well. What I had to do at that time was, after I came back home to Bremen, I had to get another truck, and the one of the dealers down here had an old Mercedes that I bought from him. Bobby Brown was his name. And I bought that truck and built a body on it and got it back on the road. I think I probably lost maybe 2 weeks' work, and that's all. So we really got going in earnest to build that truck. And I started out again, peddling fish and doing the odd jobs, and things were going good. And then I got a phone call, and it was a Friday late afternoon. And it was a guy named White. His last name was White, and he was, I can't remember his first name, but he was a colonel. And when he called, I listened. And I said something to the effect, "Hi, Colonel White, how can I help you?" He says, "Jeff, You've done a good job for the outfit up here in Bangor, where I was a medic, a flight medic. He said, we'd like to send you to flight school down to Fort Rucker, Alabama. And I kind of went silent for a while because I knew my life was going to change. I didn't know how much it was going to change, but I knew it was going to change. I had to give everything up after building this truck and my route and getting my route going again. And I said, can you give me till Monday to make a decision on this? I need to talk to Rebecca, my wife. And he said, sure, but I got to know by Monday because we've got other people who will take your place if you can't go. Rebecca and I sat down and we talked about it and, did the old pros and cons list, which I still have, by the way. And we decided it would be best for us as a newly married family. Now, this is our logic back then, for me to go to flight school. And part of the logic was in working all these part-time jobs, I was working probably 14 hours a day up here in Maine. And I figured it'd be better for me to work 14 hours a day doing one job than 14 hours a day doing 2 or 3 jobs. So we went down to Alabama. I went by myself, actually. The first 16 weeks, we were separated because of that, and it was pretty rigorous. I was an enlisted person. I was an E5 at the time, went down there. And so it was a rigorous program, but it was one that I very much liked. And I came home after a year's schooling. Rebecca did move down with me after 16 weeks of being separated. And we had a pretty good time in Alabama. We made some wonderful friends, worked hard, but the training was super. And I moved back from Alabama back to Maine, and thinking that I'd go back into the fish business again and my life would go on where I had briefly stopped it in order to go to flight school. But all the time when I was home, I had this inner feeling, I guess it was, of really liking the military, more than I ever thought I would. And so I applied to go on active duty as a warrant officer. And after about 3 or 4 months, I was accepted to go on active duty, which I did. And my first duty assignment was with the 101st Airborne Division down in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. And Rebecca and I left Bremen, Maine in a used Airstream trailer that we had traded a car with a person over in Warren. And we took off, both she and I and our dog named Duke. And away we went to Fort Campbell, Kentucky to start a new life in the Army. I enjoyed flying down there at Fort Campbell. I flew rescue, and we saw things that I otherwise never would have seen. And then one night, we were called to deliver blood to a hospital up in Kentucky, right over the line into Kentucky. I had to go down to Nashville, pick up the blood. I was a co-pilot. Pick up the blood in Nashville and take it up to Kentucky, to Madisonville, Kentucky. We went and we got the blood to the hospital, and that was all good news. The weather had come in at that point in time, and we made a decision that we would come back to our base. We would fly back and try to fly low enough so we could get underneath the clouds to get home. It was probably about a 45-minute flight. Unfortunately, on the way, we struck some wires, and we landed in the highway. The helicopter that we were in landed upside down. My side of the aircraft was flattened. They said that my side was unsurvivable, but the way things happen sometimes isn't the way they should happen, and the pilot died. And I was very saddened by that. The guys that were in the back, the medic and the crew chief, were broken up pretty bad, and both of them had to get out of the service because of the physical problems they had due to the crash. Now, while they rushed me, I got out of the aircraft somehow. They had pronounced me dead, and I had wiggled my foot inside that aircraft. And they said, no, he's still alive. And I had gotten their attention, and I said, take care of the guys in the back, because they were in really bad shape. I said, I think I can get out. My head had been pinned actually between the armored seat and the road. And when I popped myself out of my helmet, it just a miracle that it came out. And I was able to crawl out of that non-survivable side of the aircraft. And as soon as I got out, I fainted, or actually I went into shock. And they took me to the nearest hospital, which happened to be the Fort Campbell Hospital. And I was in ICU for a while, recovering. While I was in ICU, I had a fellow warrant officer come in and talk to me and said, do you know that you must have had a guardian angel that protected you? And of course, I didn't believe any of that stuff. I didn't believe guardian angels existed and things like that. But I listened to him. And deep inside, I knew that there was a miracle that had taken place and that I was saved. I didn't know why, but I knew that I was saved from death, if you will. And so I healed. I stayed grounded. I couldn't fly for a year. They had to do tests on me and psychological tests and things like that. And after a year, I was able to fly. I put in for a direct commission while I was in the 101st, and eventually, in time, in about 3 months, they had granted it to me. So I went from being listed to being a warrant officer, and from a warrant officer to being a commissioned officer. And that all happened at Fort Campbell. That accident allowed me to refocus on my life. My wife, Rebecca, took it. She took it. It was hard for her having to worry about me flying. And we had our first child at that point in time. And I was all about my job. I mean, I loved to fly. Sometimes I wondered why I was even paid for doing that. And of course, then there was other times, like I just described, when there wasn't enough money in the world to get me back in the cockpit. But that was my life at that point in time. As I was laying in bed one night down at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, I had this memory that came into my mind. And all of a sudden, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I woke up my wife, and I said, honey, go get that file about the accident I had in the fish truck. And I told her where it was, and she went and got it. And I opened it up, and I looked at the police report, and it was on March 4th, 1977, at 5 o'clock at night. And then I looked at the accident report of when I had crashed in the helicopter. It was March 4th, the same date, 3 years later, at about 5 minutes to 5 at night. Now, there was something going on. And as stubborn as I was, I never even thought that this was God working in my life, but I know now that it was. And he was trying to get the attention of a pretty thick knucklehead who didn't quite get it, that God had a purpose in my life that I was about to experience. And at that point in time, I came down on orders to go to Enterprise, Alabama, where they wanted me. I became an instructor pilot and went on working with new and young pilots. And the Lord sent me, unsaved now, the Lord sent me to a town of Enterprise, Alabama, that had 80 churches in it. 80. Most all of them evangelical. About half of them were black churches. And needless to say, on Tuesday nights down there in Enterprise, Alabama, it was visitation night. And people were knocking on your doors. It was like Halloween. People were knocking on your doors, and praying for you and giving you handouts, tracts and things like that. And my wife loved it. She invited them in, and I'd go hide in the bedroom and things like that, and they'd tell her about scripture and things like that. So God was really getting a hold of the Norton family, but I still didn't quite get it. And we lived in a development down there that was surrounded by chicken farmers and peanut farmers. And one day, a chicken farmer come by the house. And he stopped and he came over and he goes, "We have got a great chicken dinner we'd like to give you up at the church tonight if you want to come. And we got the best cakes and the best pies in the whole county." I thought about that for a while, and sure enough, I went to Rebecca and said, let's go up to the church and have a good meal. And not that my wife didn't cook good meals, she sure did. But off we went, and we went to that church. And I met the pastor, and I thought I was going to run into this big fat guy. But no, this guy had been a quarterback at Florida State University, and the Lord had changed his life. And he began ministering to me right off the bat. That was a special time. All of a sudden, I started thinking about the Lord, and thinking about His plan for me, and thinking about my existence. At about that same time, a fellow helicopter pilot had come to me and asked if I wanted to join him in a Bible study, which I did. And he started to teach me about the workings of Christ and the workings of the Bible. And he invited me to a small group, me and Rebecca, to a small group, which we went to. Most all in that group were military guys of all ranks, enlisted and officers. And so I was being discipled as a non-believer by a group of soldiers who believed in Christ. My wife was very sensitive to the working of the Spirit. Consequently, she got saved. And it was remarkable, the change in her. Absolutely remarkable. About 6 months later, after I was dealing with some inner pressures that I was going through of being a dad, or being an insufficient dad, let's put it that way. At that point in time, we had 2 children. My daughter Laura was born down there in Alabama. That I felt so inadequate. And I was thinking about these sermons that I had heard and the discipleship that I was undergoing. And I knew that God was drawing me. So it was one warm day in Alabama. It was about 95 degrees outside, and the humidity was probably about the same. And I decided, perhaps foolishly, to go for a run in the middle of the day through our neighborhood and down a red dirt road that was near our neighborhood. Rattlesnakes all over the place and things like that. Not that I had only seen one and he was dead, but that was enough for me. But I ran down this road, and at about the 2-mile mark, sweat coming off my body, I surrendered to the Lord. And I asked him, I said, "Lord, I can't make it on my own. I'm a terrible dad. I put too much time in at work and not enough with family. Would you come into my life and help me?" And I want to tell you, in an instant, he did. And I turned around at that 2-mile mark, and I ran back. I can't even remember what kind of time I had that day, but it was a good one. I was drenched in sweat. Ran through this little field that I knew that there were snakes in. Just didn't bother me a bit. Ran right through the field, ran home, ran into the house, opened the door, and I said, "Honey, you wouldn't believe what just happened to me." And she did believe it. And I became a changed person from the inside out. Still flawed, but changed. And that was in 1985, around there. I was 35 years old when that happened. We left Alabama. We got restationed to Fort Devens, Massachusetts for a couple of years. We went to the Post Chapel up there, a wonderful chaplain, and we still are in touch with his wife. He's with the Lord right now. And so we had a good experience up at Fort Devens. I was the executive officer of a combat support hospital that eventually deployed in Gulf War I. And that was, I loved it. I loved that job. After that, the Army sent me to Syracuse University, where I worked on my master's program in business, and I was there for 15 months, and that was awesome. I really enjoyed that as well. We attended a local church right outside Syracuse, which was, this is all part of my building process. After that, I went to Germany for 3 years, and they were great years. We had wonderful post chaplains over there. We saw a different part of God's creation over in Europe, particularly down in the Alps, where we had a trailer down there that we owned, that I bought from a guy actually from Maine. Can you imagine that, being in Germany, buying a trailer from a guy in Maine? And we stayed down there, and we just saw God's creation in a different light down there. And after that, they sent me to Fort Drum, New York, where I had command of a medical evacuation unit, and we covered all the Adirondacks, and we had training missions to Central America. We had training missions all over the place. It was we were part of the 10th Mountain Division at that point in time, and it was really great. We attended post chapels. So the post chapels are wonderful, but you really don't get into the spiritual side of things unless you do it on your own. After we left Fort Drum, we went to Stewart Army Subpost down near West Point, and that was my first taste of a local church that was really big into discipleship. And we really enjoyed our tour down there. Unfortunately, after that tour was over, I was reassigned down to Fort Rucker, Alabama again, and I went down there unaccompanied for 1 year, while my kids, who were teenagers, they were in high school, stayed in right outside of West Point, New York, and went to school. But after 1 year, it became very apparent to me that my time in the Army was coming to an end. And so I retired after 22 and a half years of active duty and 28 and a half years of total military service. I retired and came up to Maine, where my mom and dad were living at the time, and where we were able to buy a home eventually, where we're sitting in that home as we speak right now. Maine had its challenges when we came back, and we found a local church up in Waldoboro that was wonderful. That church challenged me to use my spiritual gifts. I became a member there. I was part of leadership, and that church up here in Waldoboro really was foundational to my future growth in the Lord. The kids were discipled in church, and our kids all went through their own individual trials, as did I, and the Lord always showed up. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. The church was big into accountability and accountability groups, and it was just wonderful, wonderful. I was a deacon. I became an elder and the head of the elders board at that in short order, and I continued to grow, and I continued to grow because of the trials that were in my life, in our life, Rebecca's life, in my family's life, actually. My pastor and my assistant pastor both came down with cancer, are both with the Lord right now. And I saw that church actually come together in a way that was supernatural, focusing on the one true God. And so I was thankful to see that happen, and I could see a church really going deep because of a trial. And I too had trials in my life at that time. In 2017, I was involved in a church plant in Damascotta, Maine, and I loved the people that were part of that core team. I was part of that core team, and we planted a church called Twin Villages Church in Damascotta. At that same time, or shortly thereafter, I was accused of rape by my then daughter-in-law. There were others that were named as well, to include both my sons and also both my deceased pastors. And although I was exonerated through the legal system, I really had to lean on the Lord. The attacks from that particular individual still continue, and because of that, I continue to lean on the Lord every day. I will tell you that praying for those who are attacking you has been difficult, but I have learned that real and pure justice is in fact received only from the Lord. The Lord, again, just like he did in Alabama, just like he did in Kentucky for my accident, became my refuge. And I am thankful for that. So I'm thankful for those trials. There's a psalm, it's Psalm 119, verse 71 says, "It was good for me to be afflicted so that I could learn your statutes." Boy, oh boy, is that ever true. The Lord again got my attention, and I was being reared for another growth spurt. And in 2022, I came down with esophageal cancer. They found a tumor where my esophagus joins with my stomach. They knew that they had to operate soon. They put me on chemo. They put me on radiation. And at that point in time, I was bitten by a tick, unbeknownst to me, but if you live in Lincoln County, Maine, that's not unusual. And I came down with a tick-borne disease called babesiosis. And one of the symptoms of babesiosis is that it reduces your platelets to the point that your blood doesn't clot. And what happened is the tumor in my esophagus was starting to bleed internally. Consequently, it was in February that they found the tumor. I went through chemo and radiation with an expected date of surgery down in Boston of June. But because of the babesiosis, I wasn't able to have that surgery until the end of October of 2022. And because of that delay in that surgery, of course, all of this is underneath the umbrella of the Lord. I came down with a spreading of the cancer. They thought they got it all, but they didn't. And it is now stage 4, and it's into my lungs, and they'll take a picture here in another 2 or 3 weeks, and we'll find out if it's gone any other place. But what I decided, what Rebecca and I decided after much prayer, is to not go back underneath chemo. Chemotherapy for some people is a godsend. For me, it took me away from my family. It seems like every time I went underneath a chemo or a immunotherapy treatment, I would spend 2 or 3 weeks in the hospital and then spend a couple more months recovering from that hospital stay afterwards. So Rebecca and I, after much prayer, decided not to continue with chemo. And because of that, I'm able to give my testimony the way I am right now. And I really feel great. And I love the Lord more now than it seems like I ever had. And so I am thankful for those trials that he has put me through. I can honestly say that my relationship with God and Rebecca's relationship, God, is more a treasure now than it ever has been. And even as I think of it, I start to tear up. Prayer has been so uplifting. There are prayer warriors, not only in Damascus, and Russie Lane is one of them, but there are prayer warriors all over the world that are lifting Rebecca and myself up in prayer. In Eastern Europe, where my daughter lives, a number of churches there. In Australia, somebody we met up camping up in Eustis, Maine, is praying for us over there and around the country the same way. I've become an elder at the church over the last year, and that has been super edifying. A week or so ago, I started a 22-week discipleship study with 5 men in our church from the ages of 21 to 89. There's quite a large shot group there. The name of the class is called Boot Camp. It's appropriately named. It's for men, and it gets into the nitty-gritty of being a man leaning on the Lord with all the life's trials that men go through. You know, I'm having a wonderful life. I don't regret a minute. Sometimes I wish I got saved long before I was 35, but God didn't have it that way. He certainly could have done that, but he didn't. So I've seen both sides. Half of my life has been lived for Christ. I'm 75 years old as of yesterday. I just turned 75, and I am thankful. So I'm having a wonderful life with the life that God has given me up to now. He has really gifted me. I like to close with one particular verse. The Lord gave me this verse as I was doing a Bible study, and I don't know how. I can't remember the circumstance, but I do remember what the verse is, and let me read it to you now before we close. It comes out of 2 Corinthians 4. It's verses 16 through 18, and it reads, "That is why we never give up. Though our bodies are dying, our spirits are being renewed every day. For our present troubles are small and won't last very long, yet they produce for us a glory that vastly outweighs them and will last forever. So we don't look at the troubles we can see now. Rather, we fix our gaze on things that cannot be seen. For the things we see now will soon be gone, but the things we cannot see will last forever." I thank you for the time that I've had to share this, my testimony, my story with you. I pray that the Lord will use it to edify himself, and I stand ready to be used until God takes me home. Thanks again.